The next session to talk about to discuss about the journey to cloud sovereignty, we have Martin Hoskin, who's the field CTO for cloud providers Broadcom, and he will also be joined by Brad Howarth, who is a technology and innovation expert and an independent consultant. So let me hand it over to Martin.
Thank you, and very warm welcome from myself as well. I travelled from the UK to be here today, and the reason that I've travelled across the world is because this is a hot topic, and it's a particularly hot topic in Europe at the moment for a whole range of different reasons, and I'm going to talk about some of those with us today. So first of all, let me just click through, there we go, that's me. Okay, so first of all, Broadcom do not own and operate clouds. There is an exception to that. There's VMware Cloud on AWS, which we still continue to operate today, but we don't own and operate our cloud provider clouds. They're owned and operated by regional partners. We provide a toolkit of software that allows them to build cloud platforms that enables them to sell services and solutions to their customers. And as you probably know, there is no one definition of sovereignty. Sovereign cloud, sovereign platforms, there is no one definition of this. And this is the one that we use at Broadcom. And this is from Gartner, and it's a very well-established and well-accepted definition. But as you can see here, sovereign cloud is the provision of cloud services within a jurisdiction, meeting data residency requirements and operational autonomy. It is intended to ensure that data and infrastructure is free from control by external jurisdictions and protected from foreign government access. And it's that second sentence, it is the big differentiator for Broadcom for VMware technology. Because of our very nature of our products, because of our heritage, these products run in local data centers, and they are not globally connected and interconnected. And when there is an issue, when there is an outage, or when there is a legal issue around some data within those jurisdictions, it is handled locally within that cloud provider, as opposed to being handled by a global authority. So here is our definition, again, running this out. So the sovereign ownership of the cloud provider is very, very important. That cloud provider is a business entity that is owned and operated within the region of that cloud. No external jurisdiction control or unlawful access into that data. The data, of course, resides, and very specifically resides within that region. It is operated by citizens of that region, and depending on the requirements, there may be some compliance requirements, regulatory requirements around security clearance, or other things that make it appropriate for certain people to operate those environments and certain people not to operate those environments, and of course, compliant with local laws. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these numbers here, but if you look at all of the different analyst reports from IDC, from Gartner, from Forrester, and others, you'll see that this is a hugely growing market within the cloud business. So it's around 23, 27, maybe 28 CAGR growth year on year. So there's certainly a lot of interest. And again, where I live, and I live in the UK, but particularly in European countries, in EU-based countries, there is a huge, huge drive towards digital sovereignty now. And it's not because the subject has changed, it's because the world around it has changed. We've been talking and running these events in Europe for about 4 or 5 years, and we always have very good attendance. We always have a lot of interest from both local politicians, from EU-based politicians, and from our partners. But now the world is changing around that, and it's making a significant difference. And as a result of that, 84%, and this is some IDC numbers here from last year, of organizations are either currently using sovereign cloud or planning on using sovereign cloud in the coming year or so. And that is a huge shift. That is a huge shift from the statistics we used to see a few years ago when people were planning to use public cloud. All the things that were driving that, and again, I won't go through all of these, but most of them are quite clear. Cybersecurity is a big element of this. Also, the exposure to external legal frameworks is a big factor of this. Interoperability and workload portability and data portability is another key aspect of this, both from a cost perspective, but also then from a technology perspective. There are just a range of different things that are driving this, and you can see these here. There isn't one thing driving the sovereign cloud story, particularly in Europe. It is multiple different things. And just to be clear, this is really what we're talking about. These are the two US legislations that caused the most concern. Okay, so the Cloud Act, very well understood the Cloud Act is. Donald Trump in his first round as president enacted some changes to the Cloud Act, which basically meant that the legal entity, the US legal entity of that company, could be forced to provide data in any data center in the world, whether it was in Paris, in Dublin, or in Frankfurt, and it wouldn't matter that that data was residing outside the US. More concerned sometimes about FISA. FISA is much more secretive. Okay, we have very few examples of where FISA has been used because it is done completely behind closed doors, closed court doors. The one example that we do have was leaked by Snowden in 2013, which was the PRISM project, where the NSA collected data from Apple, from Facebook, from Microsoft, and all the other big US tech companies and fed all that data through. And that was exposed by Snowden. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't know about it, because FISA happens completely behind closed doors. But just as well, there is US-based legislation as well, very, very similar, and of course that impacts Chinese-based legislation as well, which impacts obviously Huawei, AliCloud, and others. But the US has made arrangements with some countries where some of these things are less relevant, and Australia is one of those countries. So just like the UK, we have multiple agreements in place with the US on data sharing, whether it's intelligence, defense, security, criminal activity. We have those in place already. So to some extent here in Australia, we already share data with our partners in the US, and just like in the UK. So the Cloud Act agreements with the UK and Australia made in 2024. Also, Australia, of course, is a Five Eyes country, just like the UK, like Canada, like New Zealand, like the US. Post-war, 1946, Five Eyes was agreed. And effectively, it means you don't spy on your other people within the Five Eyes agreement. And there's a huge amount of collaboration that goes on in the Five Eyes. I do some work in the UK under the security services in the UK, in Cheltenham with GCHQ. And when I go there, they're not particularly concerned about sharing data with the US. If I go and have a conversation in Paris, Germany, or in Belgium, it's a very, very different conversation. A very, very different conversation. So here is the big element. And when we talk about hyperscalers, it's data residency versus data sovereignty. Now, AWS in Europe are going to launch a sovereign cloud. Microsoft have a sovereign cloud solution, but they're still US business entities and subject to US laws. So you have to consider whether you can provide a sovereign cloud while still under the jurisdiction of a foreign country. That's the big question that comes up around sovereignty, is can a US-based company provide a sovereign cloud in a different jurisdiction when they have access to that data and under certain circumstances, as we've seen, have to share that data with US law enforcement. So data residency is straightforward. It's where the data resides. And absolutely, Microsoft, AWS, Google can all provide data residency as a part of their solutions. So that's absolutely clear. But data sovereignty is about the jurisdictional control, the authority of the data, the legal authority over that data, where it resides, but also the authority over it. And that's really, again, we talked about Broadcom's differentiator with our partners. That is one of the key differentiation elements with our partners versus hyperscalers. And this is growing year on year around this importance. And also, obviously, thanks to the changes and maybe the more aggressive, the more assertive approach from Donald Trump in the US, that has escalated this conversation. So just from an emerging trends perspective, in Europe, just a quick few numbers, 72% of cloud spend in EU countries is with these three companies. That's 264 billion euros every year goes from the EU to the US for cloud services. There are lots of ways of thinking about that. Think about it from a concentration of risk perspective, and we've seen that just this week with major outages in AWS. But also think about it from an economic perspective, from a skills perspective, from an innovation perspective, where you're effectively outsourcing all of these different elements to a US-based company rather than growing them locally here in Australia. And here's just one example of that. So Sadiq Khan, who is the prosecutor for the ICC, that's the International Criminal Court, part of the EU institutions, had his email address and his Office 365 account taken away from him via subpoena from the US. And now, again, put the politics to one side. The International Criminal Court, and specifically Khan here, was investigating potential war crimes in Gaza. Absolutely justifiable, maybe, depending on your political views. But put the politics to one side here, and this institution and 900 of its European employees were stripped of their Office 365 accounts. Okay, so Microsoft were forced to cancel these accounts via a subpoena signed by Donald Trump. Okay, and this in Europe has caused a huge amount of concern. And this guy, Anton Connard, is the French legal leadership from Microsoft. Okay, he runs the legal team in Microsoft. And here he is in the French Senate, and you can watch this on YouTube, admitting to the French Senate that no, Microsoft cannot guarantee digital sovereignty and cannot guarantee privacy of that data in France. And this actually went into mainstream media. Okay, not just the tech media, we see these things in tech media regularly, but in Europe this went across mainstream media, that Microsoft were openly admitting they could not guarantee sovereignty after their marketing team had spent millions and billions on trying to convince their customers that they could. Okay, so sovereign AI, and Savian mentioned this already, and it's been mentioned already, this is emerging. A lot of money being spent, not clear exactly yet how this will play out, but a lot of interest, because when you're talking about data sovereignty, a natural next step is to talk about how that data is used in an AI context. So again, no real definition of what sovereign AI is. Based on the paper that I've written, this is what I've set out as being the key criteria, but other people might disagree with that. So things like independence from individual providers, consideration of regulatory frameworks, because we do have an AI Act out of the EU at the moment, which has been implemented currently. Compliance with data protection and transparency, avoidance of potential copyright infringements, and we've all seen that play out in various courts as well, with copyright infringements for being used by for building large language models. And then no unwanted use of your own data in training models. So again, no clear definition, and this is emerging technology, and this will change over time, but it's worth starting to think about this already and how you, from an organization perspective, will leverage AI and what control you will have over that data. And then just finally, from a VMware Broadcom perspective, and we're not here really to sell technology today, we're not here to talk about VCF today, but we are an established leader in this space. In Europe, we have more than 300 government clouds delivering sovereignty within region for those institutions. And we've been doing this for more than 20 years. So there's lots of different elements there from the platform perspective, from the delivery model, from the data sovereignty perspective. But as we've already heard, we are in a unique position here. Broadcom and our VMware technology and other technologies as well from CA and Symantec provide this level of sovereignty that we are unable to see from US-based public cloud providers. I mentioned already we're running multiple of these events as part of our Explore on tours. We're running Brussels in June. We're here today in Sydney and Frankfurt next month as well. So you can see the clear definition here from a Broadcom perspective of how we're driving this narrative. Now I'd like to invite Brad, who is much more local expertise than I have in this space. So maybe Brad, you just introduce yourself first of all.
Yes, hello, Brad Howarth. I actually started off as a tech journalist way back in the 1990s. And my experience with VMware, I think, extends back 21 years to when I led a roadshow around the country back then, which was introducing VMware to Australia. It was quite interesting back then, the questions we were getting about this notion of what virtualization is were very quite simple and basic, and then we went on to see Australia become one of the most virtualized countries in the world, which was quite fascinating at the time. But these days I work more independently, so working as a consultant across various organisations, and have continued keeping a watch on what's been happening with regard to the movement of virtualisation towards the cloud and towards the era of the sovereign cloud that we're discussing now.
Perfect. So what is your view on sovereign cloud, and how is it really playing out in this region?
Well, in order to understand what sovereign actually means, we can actually blame the Romans for that one. Because if anyone here speaks Latin, you'll know that the word sovereign comes from the word superinus, which you have to be very careful when you pronounce, which went through classic French, which Sylvain can probably explain to us as to why the P became a V. But if you look into the definition of the word itself, it means above, effectively, principle, above everything else. And that's really the definition that we're trying to drive towards today, is this notion that a sovereign cloud is governed in such a way that it is completely possible to understand where those lines of responsibilities lie and who those lines of responsibility lie with, and they are within an understood system, often being geographically bound. Now, why is that important today? Well, there have been several reasons why, and you've articulated those quite clearly already. When I first came across this notion of cloud repatriation, which started to become more of a mainstream topic in this country in 2017, it was very much around questions of performance and cost. Do we actually feel that we're getting the kind of return from our public cloud investments that we wanted? And a lot of organisations found they weren't, which then led again to discussion of private cloud and to sovereign cloud where we are today. As you pointed out though, right now what we're seeing is this notion of sovereign itself becoming much more important. And having a true understanding of who has access and control of your system is something that I think Australian organisations are paying far more attention to now than they ever have before. We keep talking about changing geopolitical forces. We can obviously see that one of the world's largest jurisdictions has taken a bit of a change in tone. And even if you don't consider that that is a question that you need to answer today, it is a question that you will need to answer into the future, because we can see certain changes in direction with regard to geopolitical policy. And I think if you're running your strategy based on 4-year election cycles, it's not a particularly good way to run your strategy.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. And it's interesting to see how this is going to play out. But then you mentioned about the definition of the word sovereign. What is your view then on how this is emerging, different definitions from Amazon, from Microsoft, from other players in the market?
Marketers are going to market.
Yeah.
Marketers grab onto a new word, and that word proves to be popular, and then everyone grabs onto that word and uses that word in whatever way they can. So obfuscation around what sovereign means is obviously going to be there. And of course, every provider will define sovereign based on what their offering is, just as every provider today defines artificial intelligence based on what it is that their offering happens to be. So we have probably more definitions of artificial intelligence than utterance of the word at this point in time. Is that a problem or not? It's a problem only insofar as our customers are willing to do the investigatory work themselves in order to understand what their own requirements are.
Yeah.
And I think customers are smart enough to be able to see through the smoke and mirrors that some organisations are putting forward and understand what their needs truly are and whether a vendor can meet those needs within its current construct.
Yeah.
If they can do that, and I think anyone who's taking an interest in sovereign cloud will be doing so for very strong reasons, and therefore they should be putting a strong level of governance around the decision making that goes with that.
Yeah, no, I agree. The level of awareness now is growing significantly. That's when I have conversations with CIOs, CTOs, it's the awareness now that didn't exist 5 years ago. That's the, I think, key.
And certainly it is a popular term right now, so of course you're going to see that. Now, can you see through that? I suspect so.
Yeah, we're certainly in a hype cycle. I don't know how Gartner are measuring it, but it's certainly a hype cycle at the moment for sovereignty.
Definitely.
Yeah. So what are the market drivers are you seeing here in Australia? How do you see this playing out over the next few years?
I talked earlier about the key ones that drove us to this in the first place in terms of just basic repatriation were performance and cost. When I talk to people about sovereign cloud, and I have been hosting quite a few roundtables where we're raising topics around satisfaction with public cloud providers, investment in private cloud, looking at discussions around sovereignty and control. There are two general drivers in here. It's either cost or it is the notion of jurisdictional oversight. Initially, it's cost. There are very, very strong financial reasons why you may not be happy with the performance that you're getting from your current set of providers. And that is a good spark for conversation. But increasingly now it is the question of exactly who has access to my data. And does the construct that I'm creating put me at some level of risk with regard to the accessibility of that data by a jurisdiction that I otherwise not beholden to? Now, I think the answer to a lot of those questions will be no, it doesn't yet. But you need to ask the question, because if you're going to take an all hazards approach towards the way that you operate your IT environment, then you need to consider all possible hazards. And geopolitical hazards are certainly one that we need to ask about. So that, at the moment, I think it's not necessarily something that I see as being a primary driver, but it is a concern. Yeah. And given some of the rhetoric we're seeing in some parts of the world and a general slide to what the media is considering to be authoritarianism, maybe that's a little bit too bold to say at the moment, but it is something that I think organisations need to consider. Yeah.
And then we can't have a conversation without talking about AI. It's impossible to go to any event now.
Are we still talking about AI?
Yeah, I think we are.
Really? Are we tired of talking about AI yet?
Or is that bubble gone? Is that hype cycle gone now?
Yeah.
What about in this region, sovereign AI? It's a big topic in the UK, actually, but what about here?
It's very hard to get a handle on the impact of AI on sovereign, of sovereign AI, and partly because it's very hard to actually understand what's really happening in the market today. In talking to organisations at the moment in Australia, hopefully there are some exceptions to this in the room today, but there's this issue that we have that we're not getting out of pilot. So there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of investigation, there's a lot of good intent, but there's not a lot of production.
Yeah.
And therefore a lot of conversations about where those workloads need to reside, the jurisdiction under which they need to be governed, they haven't matured to the same extent at the moment because I just don't think we're as far along that AI journey as we need to be. Yes, there's fine-tuning work happening, there's a little bit of RAG, but there's not a lot that really requires significant investment. There's a lot of the acceptance of AI tools, and particularly those that are coming pre-packaged with SaaS providers. Yeah. We're seeing a lot of that adoption, Copilot implementations and the like. But I'm not seeing so much of a crossover at the moment. But where these two matters do come to part or come together is that question of data residency. And if we're going to be doing significant amounts of AI work, then we need large amounts of data, and that data will often be quite sensitive, and therefore we do need to understand what jurisdiction that data is being governed within. So the AI component is probably just more tightly bound into the broader sovereign component than sitting as a separate discussion today.
Mm. Yeah, no, 100% with you, and I think it's going to be really fascinating to watch the next 3, 4, 5 years and see how this evolves.
Well, certainly as Australian organisations continue along that AI path, and I think as we see more use cases come into play, as we start to see stronger definitions around ROI, as we start to build up a capability around moving from pilot to production, that conversation will need to take place. Yeah. And of course, that could be 2 or 3 years from now. There could be a different set of factors altogether that are driving the decisions that we're making. So perhaps maybe it's a good idea at the moment that we don't commit too much one way or the other, but we do keep our minds open in terms of what the possibilities might be as to where we want those workloads to actually be resident.
Okay, cool. And then finally, I mentioned about this, it's more than just technology and sovereignty, it's about the local economies as well. We're seeing in Europe 264 billion of euros every year being spent on American cloud services, which the vast majority of that money will cross the Atlantic. What is your view on this, and how it might cripple local innovation, local jobs, local skills? Is that something that is a big concern here?
It doesn't seem to be, but it should be. There's a scale of economic complexity that's published each year, and I think we're currently sitting just below Botswana, which is not necessarily something to be proud of. There's this whole idea that Australia used to make things. Who here had a Holden car as they were growing up? A few people. So we used to make cars, Holdens, Fords, we had a few others, Mitsubishi. We don't do any of that anymore. We have lost significant sections of our economy, and there are many reasons for that, and a lot of them are ideological, some of them are political, some of them are purely economic. So economic complexity generally in Australia is something that we have struggled to build. Now, do we have the capacity perhaps to build economic complexity around technology? Well, yes, that's certainly an option, and that was always the promise, that when we lost manufacturing, we'd replace that with the high-tech jobs of the future. And those would be in areas like programming and information architecture in these areas. And yes, they do exist, and yes, they are growing, but they're not replacing those old jobs. Now, this question then around capability is a very important one, because if we're not building local capability, then we're not building local skills, we're not building local entrepreneurship, we're not building local innovation. And I think to simply say that we will put our future into the hands of 3 foreign multinational organisations who are ultimately reporting to a share market in another part of the world, while they do perform a fantastic job as being a training ground for a lot of skill and development, if there are no local employers to take some of that up, or there is no innovative spark in order to create the next generation of local services, we do face a fairly substantial crisis. And we see already in this country that it is difficult to attract kids into jobs in STEM and technology. It's going backwards at the moment. It's not helped by the fact that we've had rounds of redundancies in that space. But if we want to be able to compete globally, if we want to be able to be considered a strong economy on all measures, then economic complexity has got to be one of them. And our investments in a local technology ecosystem has got to be foremost within that. So I'll be very curious to hear the conversation about policy in a moment, but it's something that I think needs to be given constant consideration and a much higher level of debate, because otherwise we'll find ourselves a little bit like our manufacturing sector, doing bits and pieces around the edges, but not making anything meaningful.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the key things that isn't being discussed at the moment, this, the economic impact, the long-term, medium-term and long-term economic impact of just outsourcing to foreign large multinational corporations.
When I started as a tech journo, so this is 90s, early 2000s, the bright young things that were coming through as technology specialists at that time would often say, if I really want to move ahead in the world, I've got to move to Silicon Valley. And we saw this constant exodus of bright young things moving to Silicon Valley. And a good number have come back. People like Larry Marshall, who went on to run the CSIRO here, was a great example of that. Could not find work at the skill level that he could actually provide in this country, so went to Silicon Valley, set up several companies and came back again. Now, perhaps, we're at a point where we have enough of a local ecosystem where that brain drain doesn't take place to the same extent, but it is still there.
Yeah.
And if we're not fostering that at all levels, and it's not just about creating the applications that run on top of the sovereign clouds, it's about having all layers of capability all the way down to the bottom. Because without that, we've got a very hollow ecosystem.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Brad. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and hope you have a good conversation and a good event today.
Looking forward to it. Thank
Cool.
you.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you, Martin and Brad. Fascinating topic. Thank you for giving us a broader perspective of especially what's happening in Europe. It seems like Europe is leading the way in many of these topics, and also Brad for providing us a very local perspective on how sovereignty plays out on a day-to-day basis.